In the heart of South Wales, there is a place of beautiful gloom where lush green hills bear the scars of a long-gone industrial age. This is the land of the valleys, communities built on coal and held together by a fierce, resilient spirit. It was into this world, in the winter of 1967, that a boy was born who seemed to embody the quiet, contemplative soul of the landscape itself. He was not destined to work in the mines like the generations before him. His future would be forged not with his hands, but with his extraordinary mind. His name was Richard James Edwards. He grew up to be a reader, a scholar, a keen observer who saw the world through a lens of political history and philosophical poetry. For years, his was a quiet voice, confined to notebooks and the margins of books. But through a remarkable alchemy of friendship, ambition, and pain, he would find a way to make that voice heard, and it would emerge as a raw, articulate, and devastating roar. This is the story of his life, a journey from the studious quiet of a small Welsh town to the bleeding edge of rock and roll fame, where genius and suffering would collide, culminating in one of the most profound and enduring mysteries of our time. This is the story of Richey Edwards, told not from the end, but from his very beginning. Richard Edwards was born on December 22, 1967, in Blackwood, a former coal mining town in Monmouthshire, Wales. Unlike the turbulent upbringings that mark the stories of so many rock icons, Richey's childhood was, by all accounts, remarkably stable, happy, and filled with love. He grew up in a small, well-kept home with his father, Graham, a probation officer, his mother, Sherry, a housewife, and his younger sister, Rachel, to whom he was deeply and protectively devoted his entire life. The Edwards family was close-knit, providing a secure foundation that stood in stark contrast to the economic uncertainty that surrounded them. The Blackwood of Richey's youth was a town grappling with its identity. The coal pits that had been the lifeblood of the community for over a century were closing down one by one, a casualty of the harsh economic policies of the 1980s. This decline left a void, a sense of a future foreclosed that deeply impacted the generation growing up in its shadow. While many of his peers found their escape in local pubs and youthful rebellion, Richey found his in the library. He was an exceptionally bright and studious child, known for his politeness, his shyness, and his insatiable appetite for reading. Books were not just a hobby, they were his entire world. He devoured history, philosophy, poetry, and political theory with a passion that set him apart. He was an intellectual living in a working-class world, an outsider by virtue of his own mind. His academic prowess was undeniable. He excelled throughout his schooling, eventually earning a place at the University of Wales, Swansea, to study political history. There, he thrived, graduating in 1989 with a 2:1 honors degree. His dissertation focused on the foreign policy of the British Labour Party in the post-war era. This period of his life is crucial to understanding the man he would become. He was not a disaffected dropout who stumbled into rock and roll. He was a trained academic, a scholar who understood the complex machinery of power, history, and ideology. This intellectual framework would become the bedrock of his lyrical art, giving the Manic Street Preachers a depth and substance that no other band of their era could match. During his youth, Richey formed an unbreakable bond with 3 other boys from the area who shared his sense of alienation and his love for music and culture. They were James Dean Bradfield, a quiet boy with a burgeoning, powerful voice and a preternatural talent for the guitar; Sean Moore, his cousin, a stoic and technically gifted drummer; and Nicky Wire, a lanky, sharp-tongued, and equally intelligent friend who would become Richey's closest confidant and lyrical collaborator. The four of them were more than just friends. They were a gang, a self-contained unit united against the boredom and perceived hopelessness of their surroundings. They spent their teenage years listening to records, The Clash, Public Enemy, Guns N' Roses, and dreaming of a more glamorous, meaningful existence. From this gang of four, the Manic Street Preachers were born. Initially, the musical core was James and Sean, with Nicky on bass. Richey, with no formal musical training, took on the role of the band's driver and roadie. He would haul their gear to and from the small, often empty pubs they played in the early days. But his contribution quickly became far more significant than that of a mere chauffeur. His vast intellectual knowledge, his sharp aesthetic sense, and his talent for crafting provocative slogans and profound lyrics were indispensable. He and Nicky formed a formidable lyric writing partnership, and Richey's role evolved into that of the band's minister of propaganda, its chief ideologue, and its visual architect. He was officially brought into the lineup as a rhythm guitarist, though everyone in the band openly admitted that his musical ability was secondary. His real instrument wasn't the guitar, it was ideas. The band they created was a complete anomaly in the dour, shoegazing British indie scene of the late 80s and early 90s. They were a riot of contradictions. They were working-class boys who quoted French philosophers. They were fiercely socialist, but embraced a glamorous, androgynous look inspired by American hair metal and punk rock. They were armed with a manifesto, famously declaring their audacious plan to release one masterpiece double album, Generation Terrorists, which would sell 16 million copies worldwide, after which they would dramatically split up, preserving their legend forever. It was a statement of breathtaking arrogance and ambition, and it got them noticed. After signing with a small independent label, they released their first single, Suicide Alley, in 1988, followed by a string of EPs and singles that showcased their unique blend of punk energy, hard rock riffs, and politically charged lyrics. By 1991, they had created enough buzz to sign with a major label, Columbia Records. It was during this period that Richey truly came into his own as a public figure, with his chiseled cheekbones, dark, expressive eyes, often accentuated by heavy eyeliner, and a wardrobe that fused military chic with leopard print coats. He was an instant icon for a generation of disaffected, intelligent youths. In interviews, he was intense, articulate, and disarmingly honest, a stark contrast to the monosyllabic posturing of many of his peers. But as the band's star began to rise, the intense pressures of the music industry and the relentless cycle of touring began to take a severe toll on Richey's fragile psyche. Behind the confident and often confrontational exterior was a man wrestling with profound personal demons. He began to suffer from severe depression, using alcohol as a way to self-medicate and numb the pain. He also developed a severe battle with anorexia, a condition rarely acknowledged or understood in men at the time, which he would later explore with harrowing detail in his lyrics. And he began to self-harm, using physical pain as a way to feel something real, to verify his own existence amidst the growing artifice of rock stardom. This private internal struggle erupted into the public consciousness on May 15th, 1991, in one of the most shocking and infamous moments in the history of music journalism. Following a gig at the Norwich Arts Center, the band was being interviewed backstage by Steve Lamacq, an influential journalist for the popular music paper New Musical Express, or E&ME. During the conversation, Lamacq, doing his job as a skeptical journalist, questioned the band's authenticity, suggesting that their revolutionary, often violent imagery and slogans might be just a manufactured gimmick to grab headlines. He was essentially asking, is this for real? Richey, who had been quiet for much of the interview, didn't argue. He didn't shout. He met the journalist's gaze, calmly took a razor blade that he was carrying, and methodically carved the words "for real" deep into his left forearm. Blood streamed down his arm as he continued to speak, his voice never wavering, trying to make his point over the stunned silence and frantic protests of those around him. The wound was deep, requiring 18 stitches at a nearby hospital. It was a horrifying act, a moment of profound psychological crisis played out for an audience of one, but it was also a desperate, bloody statement of intent. It was Richey's way of screaming silently and graphically, "This is not a game. My pain is real. Our message is real. I am real." The photograph of his wounded arm, taken shortly after, became an iconic, if deeply disturbing, image of the era. It was a visceral, undeniable cry for help broadcast on the front pages of the music press. The incident cemented his mythos as a tortured artist, a man willing to bleed for his convictions. But it also marked a point of no return, a public display of a private torment that was beginning to spiral out of control. In 1992, the band released their debut album, Generation Terrorists, a sprawling, ambitious, and sometimes flawed double album that nonetheless delivered on their promise of intellectual, politically charged rock and roll. It spawned several hits, including the iconic Motorcycle Emptiness, and established them as one of Britain's most important new bands. They toured relentlessly, but the lifestyle only exacerbated Richey's problems. His drinking intensified, his eating disorder worsened, and his depression deepened. By 1994, Richey Edwards was in a perilous state. The band, now a tight and formidable live unit, began work on their third album. This record would become Richey's magnum opus, a direct and unflinching look into the abyss of his own mind. The album was to be called The Holy Bible. To this day, it is considered one of the most brutal, uncompromising, and brilliant albums ever to emerge from the UK. The recording process itself was grim. The band chose to work in a tiny, cheap, and notoriously uncomfortable Cardiff studio called Soundspace, a claustrophobic environment that perfectly mirrored the album's lyrical content. The music they created was harsh, angular, post-punk, and relentlessly intense, a world away from the stadium rock ambitions of their debut. But it is Richey's lyrics that elevate the Holy Bible to the level of great, terrifying art. He wrote approximately 70 to 80% of the words on the album, and they constitute a direct, unmediated journey into his tormented psyche. He tackles subjects that pop music is designed to avoid, subjects drawn from his extensive reading and his own painful experiences. Of Walking Abortion critiques the failures of the political left. Archives of Pain chillingly argues in favor of capital punishment, quoting the words of serial killers. The intense humming of evil confronts the horrors of the Holocaust. And most famously, there is 4 Stone 7 Pounds, a song written from the perspective of an anorexic girl, which was a thinly veiled and utterly devastating account of his own battle with the illness. The title refers to the weight at which survival becomes medically impossible. The lyric, "I want to be so skinny that I rot from view," remains one of the most haunting and desperately sad lines in the history of popular music. The Holy Bible was a work of undeniable genius, but it was born from an almost unbearable level of personal pain. Listening to it feels like reading a private diary that was never meant to be seen. The album was released in August 1994 and was met with critical acclaim but commercial indifference. It was too raw, too real, too painful for mainstream consumption. During the subsequent tour, Richey's mental and physical health completely deteriorated. He was a skeletal figure on stage, often appearing vacant and disconnected. His self-harm continued. His bandmates, the friends who had known him his entire life, were watching him disintegrate before their very eyes, powerless to stop the descent. The tour culminated in 3 notorious sold-out shows at the London Astoria, where the band famously smashed all their equipment at the end of the final night, an act that felt like both a triumphant end to an era and a violent breakdown. Shortly after, Richey was admitted to a private psychiatric hospital, the Priory, for treatment for his alcoholism, anorexia, and severe depression. He emerged a few weeks later, seeming calmer and physically healthier, but also somehow more distant, more remote, as if a part of him had been extinguished. The band made plans to embark on a major tour of the United States, set to begin in February 1995. It was in the final days of January that Richey's behavior took on a strange, methodical quality. In the 2 weeks leading up to his planned departure for the U.S., he began visiting his bank each day, withdrawing 200 pounds in cash, accumulating a total of 2,800 pounds. He also began giving away gifts to his closest friends. For Nicky Wire, he left a book. For James Dean Bradfield, a VHS copy of the film Equus. For Sean Moore, a Zippo lighter. They were thoughtful, specific, and in hindsight, they felt like final, deliberate gestures of farewell. On January 31st, 1995, Richey and James Dean Bradfield checked into the Embassy Hotel in London's Bayswater, ready to fly to America the next day. That evening, Richey spoke to his mother on the phone. It was a normal, loving conversation. He told her he loved her. Nothing seemed overtly amiss. The next morning, February 1st, James went to Richey's room. At the agreed-upon time for their trip to the airport, there was no answer. When he managed to get the hotel staff to open the door, the room was empty. Richey was gone. Left behind was a packed suitcase. On the table was a neatly wrapped gift box containing a copy of the novel with cocaine for a close friend. A note on the front simply said, "Open me." Also left behind were his passport and his Prozac. He had taken his car keys and his wallet and simply walked out. In the days that followed, a frantic search began. Police traced his movements through his credit card receipts and his silver Vauxhall Cavalier's traffic camera sightings. He had driven back to his flat in Cardiff. From there, the trail becomes a puzzle. He visited the passport office, though his passport was later found back at his flat. A local taxi driver recalled picking up a young man matching his description from the King's Hotel in Newport on February 7th. The man asked to be driven around the Welsh valleys, including Richey's hometown of Blackwood. He was quiet and paid the £68 fare in cash. The driver dropped him off at the Severn Bridge service station. Then, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, his car was found abandoned at that very service station. The battery was dead, and there were signs someone may have been living in it for a few days. The bridge itself, a massive structure connecting England and Wales, had a grim reputation as a location for suicides. And then, nothing. The trail went cold. Richey Edwards had vanished from the face of the earth. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of chaos, confusion, and utter heartbreak. The band, his family, and his friends were plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. A police investigation was launched, but it yielded no concrete answers. The story became a media sensation, fueling endless speculation and turning a private tragedy into a public mystery. The band canceled their American tour and retreated from the public eye, shattered. The most difficult question the remaining 3 members, James, Nicky, and Sean, faced was whether to continue as a band. To some outsiders, carrying on seemed like a betrayal of Richey's memory. But for them, who had been a unit since childhood, stopping the band would have been the true betrayal, an admission that everything they had built together had died with Richey's disappearance. They made the painful decision to carry on, believing it's what Richey would have wanted. Their first album without him, 1996's Everything Must Go, was a phenomenal, unexpected success. It was a more anthemic, string-laden, and ultimately hopeful record, but it was permeated with a profound sense of loss. Several of the album's key tracks used powerful lyrics that Richey had written and left behind, making the album a tribute, a farewell, and a declaration of survival all at once. For Richey's family, the years that followed his disappearance were a long, agonizing ordeal of hope and despair. His sister Rachel became a prominent advocate for the UK charity Missing People, using her family's unimaginable tragedy to help others navigate the same painful limbo of not knowing. The debate over his fate continued for years, largely split between the tragic probability of suicide and the romantic possibility of a staged disappearance, a theory fueled by a string of unconfirmed sightings in places as far-flung as Goa, India, and the Canary Islands. Finally, on November 23, 2008, 13 years after he was last seen, Richard James Edwards was officially declared presumed dead. It was a legal formality allowing his parents to administer his estate, but it was also a moment of devastating official closure. The flicker of hope, however small, was legally extinguished. Yet, even then, Richey's story didn't end. In 2009, the Manic Street Preachers released an extraordinary album called Journal for Plague Lovers. The music was new, but every single word on the album was taken from the final folder of lyrics, drawings, and prose Richey had given to Nicky Wire just before he vanished. The band treated the folder like a sacred text. The resulting record was raw, aggressive, and difficult, a direct sonic and thematic sequel to the Holy Bible. It was the band's way of collaborating with their lost friend one last time, of giving his final words the musical life they deserved. It was a strange, beautiful, and heartbreaking resurrection. To look back on the life of Richey Edwards is to be confronted with a story of immense talent and immense pain. His legacy is complex and profound. He fundamentally changed the landscape of British rock music, proving that intelligence, vulnerability, and literary depth could be as powerful as any guitar riff. He brought taboo subjects like male anorexia and depression into the public conversation with a raw, uncomfortable honesty that stripped away stigma and provided a voice for countless others who suffered in silence. He was a paradox, a pop star who hated celebrity, an intellectual who played in a rock and roll band, a sensitive soul who projected an image of fierce, untouchable aggression. The mystery of what happened in February 1995 will likely never be solved. But perhaps the real question isn't where he went, but what he left behind. He left a body of work that continues to inspire and challenge. He left a vital conversation about mental health that is more important now than ever. And he left a perfect, tragic, and eternal rock and roll myth, a story with no final chapter about a brilliant mind who, for reasons we will never fully know, simply walked out of the frame. And that's all for today's video. Don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe so you'll always be in the loop. Thanks for watching.